Hello, my name is Steve Schreader. I'm the footwear buyer here at Midwest Mountaineering. Choosing footwear for any outdoor activity can be one of the most daunting and confusing parts of any gear selection. While choosing gear for other outdoor activities such as kayaking or camping can be more specific and niche, you're always going to have something on your feet, most of the time anyway. And so it makes your feet one of the most important parts of your body to protect and make as comfortable as possible, because your feet are your vehicle to see the world. In this video series, I'm going to go through some of the most common questions that we as footwear specialists at Midwest Mountaineering see on a relatively daily basis. I'm assuming you've probably asked many of these questions yourself. And so through this video series, I hope you gain some insight on what some of those answers might be. So when you come in and chat with us, you can gain some insight on what we mean when we say waterproof versus non-waterproof, fit, arch stability, volume, etc. Enjoy the video series, and we'll see you both in the store and the trail. So the question of fit is probably the most common question we get asked here at Midwest Mountaineering. The reality is that because your foot is probably the most important part of your body, it's the most important thing to get fitted right. And so fit really means comfortable. And that's really what it translates to, is comfortability. Now what does that mean? Well, it's subjective, right? One shoe might be more comfortable to one person versus another shoe which might be more comfortable to them. The old saying is that you need to break in a shoe, that you need to give it some time to actually get your foot accustomed to the shoe, or more or less actually have the shoe kind of soften up because it's super stiff, and you need to actually have the footwear itself, the boot itself, conform to your actual foot. While that still holds true for some footwear, primarily when we're talking about full grain leather shoes, the reality is that a lot of technology has come far enough now where it should be, most shoes, not 100% of the time, but most shoes should be comfortable right out the gate. You shouldn't necessarily need a quote-unquote break-in period for shoes. And so when you're fitting shoes, when you're at a shop, Midwest Mountaineering in this case, or anywhere, 90% of the time you should walk out of that shop with the footwear you're buying, whether it be high-end hiking boots or trail running shoes, should fit comfortable right out the gate, right out the box. There should be no issues. Now, there is still holds true that idea of breaking in. It's not so much of a stiff boot, right, breaking in around your foot. It's more so of you getting accustomed to wearing that specific style of shoe. So if you're going, say, from a hiking shoe, which you've normally used for maybe lightweight hiking, things like that, and now you're transitioning to a backpacking style boot or a trekking boot, which is higher ankle, it's more stiff, it's more rugged, it's not as pliable in the sole. That's not so much of the footwear being accustomed to you, it's the other way around. It's you getting accustomed to wearing that style of footwear. Now, if you're sticking within the same realm, right, let's say you are staying with a low hiking shoe and you're getting a brand new pair of pretty much the same exact shoe, and maybe it's, you know, technology's come around, you bought your shoe maybe 5-6 years ago and now you're changing your shoe up. There's two things you want to be thinking about when you're choosing your footwear, right? Even if it's the same thing, same type of footwear. The first thing is you don't want to get something that's too tight, right? Too narrow, too tight, and you're going to have a lot of issues. Primarily, one being that we've had instances, particularly our owner, who has had some of his toenails actually become so constricted they've actually fallen off or become blackened. Now that's an extreme issue, but it does happen, especially if that toe and those toes in that front part of the footwear is so constricted in there and constantly slamming against the front of that shoe, you're eventually going to have issues and that will risk having blackened toenails. The other side, and more important side of things, is that the narrower the shoe and the tighter the shoe, while that makes it nice and constrict and make sure your foot is snug in there, if it's too tight and too narrow, that can also result in blood constriction. And that will in turn result a lot of times in those blackened toenails. So the tighter you have your shoe and your footwear around your foot, you might risk constricting blood flow to your feet. And again, your footwear, your feet being your most important part of your body when you're doing any outdoor activity, you want to make sure you got constant blood flow. Now, the other extreme is, okay, well, I go too loose. Right? I don't want to go too loose either, because there, as the tried and true explanation shows, is that you're going to end up with blisters, you're going to end up with rashes, things like that, where you have too much breathability, too much room in your foot, or not so much in the heel placement, but in the front of the foot where you get your foot slamming against the front of the shoe. It's going to cause a lot more issues as well. So really what we're trying to, when we talk about fit, is comfortability, but also narrowing down. So we've got kind of the best of both worlds, right? So technically speaking, what we're looking for is we're looking for two major things in relationship to footwear when we're trying something on, right? The biggest thing as far as fit go is making sure that our heel is locked into place, right? So when we're talking about any footwear, right, that heel is going to be cupped into that back heel cup. Any movement of that foot inside the boot when I'm walking and the heel popping in and out of that heel cup is what's going to cause blisters generally on the sides of your heel, which is 90% of where most people get issues with blisters is on the heel because it's too large and too loose and their foot's moving inside them. So as long as that heel is locked into place and is not moving when you're walking, even if you have a lot of room up here, if that heel is locked into place, you're good to go. Now, when we're talking about toes in the front part of the boot, if this is too loose, right, and I have too much room in between where my toes are and where the front of that shoe is, a lot of times that will result in the heel slippage, but it will also result in the toes slamming against the front of the shoe, especially when I'm going downhill, because gravity, of course, is the big rule. Even in footwear, if my foot is nice and locked in that heel cup, when I'm walking normally, the minute I put my foot up at an angle, gravity takes in, it's going to shove my toes into the front of that shoe. And if I have a significant amount of space between where my toes end and where that front inside of that boot cap is, I'm going to be slamming my toes against that every time I take a step down. So in addition to having the heel cup locked in, we want to have a little bit of room for your toes, but enough where you can barely feel the inside of that toe cup. What I mean by that toe cap is this part right here. And you can see on some boots where it has kind of an extra layer of material right here. On this Oboz sawtooth, you see it right here in the form of leather, and the sole tends to come up a little bit more. On the Keen, same thing. You have this toe cap right here. So what I want is my longest toe, which is not my big toe, it's actually my middle toe, to be able to nestle and kind of just feel a little bit barely when I'm really forcing it, the ridge of that interior material. That tells me that I have enough movement or enough room where my toes are not constricted, and also when I'm walking normally, my feet can actually splay out, okay? What I don't want to have, and we were talking about constricting earlier, is I don't want to have a shoe that jams my toes super tight, right? I want to have it nice and splayed out. Again, it should be comfortable right out the gate. I shouldn't feel as I'm sitting down here trying on a pair of boots that they're too tight and I'm going to have to walk in them for weeks upon end in order for them to stretch out, right? That shouldn't be the case. And if it is the case, then we have to look at a different brand or a different model. And so that's where a lot of brands have certain niches in the size of their footwear. So for example, Oboz is kind of right in the middle of the gamut. They actually will have roughly a narrower toe cap, but they have an average size width right where the balls of the feet are, right? So yeah, I'm forcing my toes, and my big toe, and my middle toe in particular, into this larger toe cap up here, but it's tapered enough where it's going to be able to fit all of my toes in it. Now let's say I have a relatively wider feet. Some people have super wide feet, some people have narrower feet, right? Then I look at shoes that are generally wider to begin with. So to see the difference here between the Keen and the Oboz, the Keen is generally much wider than the toe cap. So someone who has generally wider feet and not narrower feet is going to feel much more comfortable in the Keen than they are in the Oboz. And vice versa, someone who is much more narrower with their foot is going to feel way more comfortable in the Oboz than they are in the Keen. They're going to feel like they're swimming in the Keen, and we don't want that. So again, even though we're talking about technical specifics like heel cap and toe cap and making sure our heel is locked in, making sure our toes are barely touching, the reality is that fit, when it comes down to it, equals comfortability. And again, comfortability should be right out the box. In the end, one of the most common mistakes that most customers come in is buying a boot or shoe that is too small or too big. And because they think it's comfortable here, right? They think it's comfortable. If you don't know right away that it's comfortable, then we have to look at something else, right? You should feel a nice, snug, your foot should be nestled in that boot like a warm blanket. That's the way footwear should work. It should not be rigid and hard and feel like you're wearing wooden clogs, right? It should be nice and comfortable. A pro tip, especially for folks who are, there's this idea of brand loyalty. I've always worn Keens, or I've always worn Obos, or I've always worn Solomons. Try not to be so brand loyal, right? If they fit well, they fit well. That's great. Continue to utilize those as the first ones you try on because you have history with that brand. But don't rely particularly on brand and color. When you come in, even if you've worn, say, Solomon's for years, you come in to look at your new footwear, try on a variety of different models and from different brands. Because technology is changing all the time, and you never know, okay, one style that was made maybe 10 years ago and it's been revamped might not be exactly the same anymore. It might fit a little bit different. Probably the most second common question we get here at Midwest Mountaineering and Footwear is whether to go with waterproof or non-waterproof footwear. The reality is that first you have to kind of understand exactly what waterproof means when it pertains to footwear, because it is a little bit different when we're talking about jackets or apparel compared to footwear. The reason being is that generally with waterproof, let's say Gore-Tex jackets, you can generally get a sense of how durable and how water barrier that material is going to be. In a style of footwear, you can't really tell where exactly that Gore-Tex material is within the footwear because you have so much other material around it, right? So what does waterproof actually mean when it pertains to footwear? Okay, because I really, unlike jackets, I can't unzip or rezip to let some air out, let some breathability in. My foot is locked into this boot the entire time. Biggest thing with waterproofing is that it's meant to prevent water from getting into the boot. Hands down, that's its primary responsibility. Anything and only within certain aspects of the footwear as well. So if I'm talking about waterproofing, particularly on this Loa Camino, waterproofing starts here and goes all the way down to the entirety of the boot. Even down in through here where these seams are on the actual, where below the laces, that's also going to have waterproof technology. It's meant to keep water out. Gore-Tex in particular, or Keen Dry for another example, are also meant to improve breathability. So we want to keep water out, but we also don't want to have your foot be sweating inside this material enough where you're going to create moisture inside the boot. So it does allow breathability and air to permeate out of the material. Here's the downside to waterproofing. Waterproofing does not allow water itself to get removed out of the boot. Okay, it would allow relatively moisture or water vapor to remove itself out of the boot, but not physical liquid water. So another question to ask of whether I should go waterproof or non-waterproof is, where am I going to be hiking the most? What terrain am I going to be hiking? What's the climate going to be like? Okay, if we're hiking in the desert or relative desert, let's say we're hiking in Utah or somewhere in the Southwest, and occasionally I might have to cross a river or a creek. But primarily about 90% of the time, I'm going to be hiking in relatively dry areas. In that particular case, going with a non-waterproof boot is way more effective than going with a waterproof boot. And here's why. One, 80% or 90% of the time you're going to be hiking, you're not going to be in water. And you're not going to be hiking enough, we're going to be brushing up against things, you're going to create your foot or make your foot get wet. So you don't need that constant protection in waterproofing. Also, non-waterproof boots, like this Sawtooth, allow way more breathability from inside the shoe to outside, and, believe it or not, a little bit more draining, which means if I do get water inside of this, it's going to drain out much easier than if I wore a waterproof boot. So if I'm occasionally walking across a creek or river in a relatively high temperature climate area that's relatively dry, going with a non-waterproof boot is way more effective because I'm going to have the breathability, I'm going to have the drainage, and again, I'm not walking in constant moisture. Now let's take the other extreme. Let's say I'm going to be walking somewhere in Seattle or in Washington State, where I'm in the upper Northwest, where it's constant moisture, even in the summer. The height of July, there's still moisture on everything. You get that heavy dew, you get the ferns you're walking by, and you get water on your feet all the time. That's an example of where footwear comes in handy, or waterproof footwear comes in handy. Because there, I'm constantly getting moisture and water brushing up against my footwear all the time. I'm not submerging my footwear, but I'm constantly getting it brushed up against the side of my feet, and I want to keep my feet dry because in that case, because of how moist it is, as soon as I get water inside the boot that doesn't permeate because it's liquid versus vapor, the soggier my foot is going to become, and that's where I start to develop issues like pruning or blistering. Not to go to extreme, but start to get feet that don't feel very good. One of the other things to think about is also, can I take a non-waterproof shoe and make it waterproof? The reality is you can. It takes a lot, and for most shoes it's not as effective as getting a straight waterproof boot. Now where would I want to do that? Well, it's kind of more of a specific situation. In some cases I might have a boot that works great, it feels great, and I'm primarily walking in places like Utah or Arizona, and I have this one trip I'm going to take where I'm going to be in an area that's relatively moist. I might want to just throw on some waterproofing on that, or in that case, you know what? I might just want to go buy a pair of waterproof boots just for that one trip and not waterproof my other ones. So it becomes a real specific situation where you might want to waterproof your existing non-waterproof boots, but it's not ideal. The last thing I would say too in relationship to waterproof versus non-waterproof is if I'm thinking about a boot where I'm going to be constantly in submerged water, right? I'm hiking in Montana. I'm going to be walking across rivers on a consistent basis where my foot is going to be constantly over the top of this boot, or the water is going to be constantly over the top of the ankle of this boot. I do not want to have a waterproof boot because, again, with my foot being constantly in this and constantly that water sloshing around in there because it's not draining, going with a waterproof boot is going to create massive problems. And even sometimes going with a non-waterproof boot may also cause issues, especially if it's not draining and being effective as far as airing out your foot. A lot of times if you're going to be in an area where you are going to be constantly walking in water, getting a boot that's hiking but also actually has a significant amount of draining capabilities. There's a number of brands out there, NRS, Chota, Danner, that make really solid draining, almost wading boots that allow you to have really significant control and stability and protection on the shoe itself to hike in. But when you're hiking consistently in waters and water all the time, where you're constantly being submerged, it allows that water, that liquid water, to fully exit out of the shoe. Yes, your feet are probably one of the most important aspects of buying any gear. And choosing between waterproof and non-waterproof is probably, in addition to fit, is probably one of the most important questions and things to be thinking about. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot of thinking to decide exactly whether you're going to go waterproof or non-waterproof. And you have to think about those questions, like, again, where am I going to be going? Am I going to be hiking in areas where I'm going to be consistently in moisture and water? Or am I going to be in a relatively arid, dry area? All those questions are going to help you narrow down exactly what shoe to pick between waterproof and non-waterproof. So this question, even though it's not as common as the first two, also gets asked quite a bit. And that question is whether or not I need to go with a heavyweight hiking or backpacking boot or a lighter weight hiking shoe. And much with everything else that we talked about, it really depends on the type of terrain you're going to be hiking in. Say, for example, you're going to be hiking in relatively loose, talus terrain, you're going on a Perna circuit, you are going to an area where you need a lot more protection around your foot, or you might be carrying a ton of gear. You're doing a full through hike of the Superior Hiking Trail, and you need a significant amount of gear in your back, so you need a lot of ankle support. That's where going with a heavier, more protective, more supportive style boot is going to be better than a low hiker. Now, let's say you're counting ounces. You're doing a fast through hike of the AT or the Pacific Crest Trail, or even just a portion of the SHT. You're only going for a weekend. You're not carrying a lot of stuff. You're carrying real lightweight gear. You don't need a ton of support. Then going with a low, lighter weight hiking shoe is way better. Or even better yet, if you're actually looking at really saving ounces, you're going with a trail runner. This is where most people land nowadays because most people are carrying lighter stuff. They're not carrying a ton of gear. So it really depends on the terrain you're going in and how much gear you're taking. And that's for the general populace. When you get into specific individuals, now it depends on, okay, do I as a person need more ankle support, or can I have a shoe that allows my ankle to be more free-forming, free-moving? And what we mean by that is, okay, if I am hiking, and let's say I hit a spot that is going to tweak my ankle one way or the other, right? If I have relatively weak ankles, and even someone who's in their 20s and 30s might have relatively weak ankles and needs more ankle support, but this is more common with folks that are older. If I end up tweaking my foot one way or the other, this will give me the support I need so that I don't do anything drastic to my ankle, right? Step on a rock, my ankle goes either way. It gives me that extra support so I don't tweak my ankle in a certain way. For those of us that are a little bit younger or have stronger ankles, the ankle is meant to absorb a lot of those things. And especially if I'm not carrying a lot of gear. If I'm not carrying a lot of gear and I don't have a lot of extra weight, my ankles are meant to handle my weight just as well as anything I have on my back. So a low hiking shoe is way better because it gives my ankle that mobility. My ankle wants to be mobile when it's walking over things. That's the whole idea behind how our bodies are designed. And so if I have relatively strong ankles, or even if I have weak ankles, and I'm hiking in a boot that's locking in my ankle in a certain part here, and I do tweak it, it's not my ankle that moves, it's my hip that moves. Because my ankle is no longer kind of mobile and maneuverable, it's locked into place. So any maneuverability is going to transfer up into another part of my body, which in this case is going to be up on my hip. So if I don't absolutely need extra ankle support, and I'm not carrying a ton of gear, I'm not carrying the kitchen sink on a giant backpacking trip, then foregoing with a higher ankle boot is much better, and going with a lower hiking shoe is significantly much better. Now let's say you're maybe a little bit hesitant to go this far, and you're like, my ankles are pretty strong, but I don't know. I still want a little more ankle support, but I don't want to go as crazy as a full backpacking boot. Well, we got you covered. In the middle, hence the name, is a midsole. So a mid-hiker has the ankle support that's required, but still gives you a bit more maneuverability when you're hiking. So if I'm in an area where I'm carrying maybe a decent amount of weight, all right, decent amount of stuff on my back, but I don't necessarily need this because I have relatively strong ankles. But this freaks me out in case I do step on a rock a certain way. Then going with a mid is way better because I get the support, I get everything I need. It's still relatively stiff, although this Nixus mid is relatively flexible, which is still fine. But I have something that's going to protect my feet. It's got the toe cap on it. It's got the support I need, but it's not going to overdo it. And this is significantly lighter than this. That's another question that we get asked. It's just the physical weight of the boot. This heavy backpacking Camino is a trekking boot. This is a heavy, beefy, burly, I can plow through anything type of boot, right? Whereas this is, and even more so, the On-Running, the Cloud Venture, this is a fast, I'm just zipping through. I'm tiptoeing through tulips with this shoe. I'm going fast, I'm going light. In fact, I'm running, hence the trail running nature of this shoe. So I'm moving really fast with this, right? But anything in between, where I'm on relatively decent terrain, I'm not too concerned about talus or scree or things that are loose. I might hit a rock here and there. I'm carrying relatively lightweight gear, but I'm not going crazy ounce, saving on ounces. But I need something a little bit more ankle support because I'm going to move a little bit faster. That's where this comes in handy. Also, one of the big concerns is, okay, am I doing a through hike or a day hike? Right? How long am I going to be out there? Because over time, a day hike, you're doing it for a short amount of time, you might not need a shoe that gives you a significant amount of ankle support or that's relatively heavy or relatively lightweight because you're not going to be out there very long, right? So if all you have or all you're looking for is a backpacking boot because you are thinking about a trip where you're doing a lot, you're carrying a lot, and you also might do day trips here and there, but you only want to get one boot, these still work great. They're totally fine because you're not worried about saving on weight, right? Because you're only out there for the day. But if I'm doing a through hike and I'm looking at, okay, well, I'm carrying a decent amount of gear, but I'll be out there for a long time. I don't want my feet to feel heavy. Right? I want to feel light. I want to feel spry. I want to be moving fast, even though I have maybe 35, 40 liters of gear on my back. That's where going with a hiking shoe or a mid is better. I still get the support I want. I still get my stability in my ankles that I want, but I'm going a little bit lighter weight, and I don't necessarily need to go with a heavy, burly backpacking boot. A lot of customers who come into Midwest Mountaineering most of the time don't understand really what we say when we're talking about arch support and volume. And it's kind of an education process, which is okay. But in this video, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what we mean when we say arch support and what we say when we say volume, and how that translates into what is going on the inside of the foot, okay, or inside the footwear. Arch support, for lack of a better phrase, is the curvature of your foot. So if we're talking about the way your foot is made, right in here on the interior of your foot, not the posterior of your foot, but the interior of your foot, you have basically a curvature of this inside arch of your foot. And the higher the arch, generally the more support you need. The lower the arch, generally the less support you need. And then obviously folks are in between. So when we say arch, that's what we're talking about. When we say support, it depends on where you land on that scale. Are you more of a high arch individual where you've got really high arches, or are you low arches? And the reason we say support is because if we take a shoe that doesn't have significant arch support, and I'll get into examples on different footwear and kind of what you're going to see when you put on that footwear from the get-go. If you have a insole or a piece of footwear that has almost no support on the inside of the foot, right? So where your foot actually hits the bottom of that footwear, when you compress your foot on the ground, it's going to basically compress that entire part of your foot. Right, it's going to do that. If there's no support here, that entire middle of your foot is going to compress every single time you step down. And that is going to put a significant amount of strain on the overall part of your foot, because the majority of your bones in your foot that connect everything is right here. And that's right where your arch is, right? So the more compression you have in that part of your foot every time you're stepping down, this is not just on one foot, this is on both feet, you're going to end up developing a significant amount of long-term issues. Now that could eventually become, it sometimes will result in plantar fasciitis or other types of foot issues or foot problems, but a lot of it can stem from not getting arch support from the very beginning when you first start wearing shoes. Now, when you're younger and your feet are still growing and your body's still growing, you haven't really defined exactly what the arch is going to look like. Usually by about your mid-teens, 15, 16, your arch is pretty much developed into what it's going to be. And so you pretty much have an idea of, okay, I know when I get to buying footwear, whether it's just walking around town, or I'm buying a hiking shoe or a hiking boot or a trail runner or even a sandal, believe it or not, I know what I'm going to need in that support. And even wearing sandals too, you need the support you want on a footwear versus going with just a straight flat sandal. Flip-flops are great, but sometimes they can cause big problems. When we're talking about different types of footwear and we're looking at boots as they come straight out of the box, how do we know that a boot is going to have enough support for us from the very beginning, or if we're going to have to get something aftermarket to mitigate that? And believe it or not, it's not on the outside what counts, it's what's on the inside. So if you look at this is a cutoff shoe of a La Sportiva. If you look at this, at least from this side, there's a significant amount of arch here, right? So right when looking at this shoe, I'm like, this is going to give me so much arch support. I'm going to have my feet are going to be golden, especially if I need a lot of support. The reality is when you turn that around and you look at the inside of the shoe, all right, this, which is going to be your actual insole, this is almost flat. The entirety of that inside of that shoe is almost flat. There is no curvature almost at all on the interior of that foot. And for that matter, the insole itself generally is not going to be as supportive, okay? Now, if you take other examples, right, again, using La Sportiva, they're great. I love their shoes. So same thing here, right? The Ultra Raptor 4, great shoe, awesome backpacking boot and hiking boot, has a significant curvature in the arch and the outsole. So my mind tells me this is going to be great for those that need higher arch support, right? Great curvature, even the inside. Great curvature where my arch is going to be. I'm going to have a lot of support in this shoe. Well, not necessarily, because the inside of this shoe looks almost identical to the inside of that shoe. And when you pull that insole out, it's just a flexible piece of foam. It does have the curvature of the arch here, and you can see what it's designed to do, but there's no support at all because it's so flexible. Now you take the other extreme, right? If we're looking at, say, like a Vask All right, this is the Vask LNT Breeze. This is straight flat in the bottom. There's no defined arch on the sole. Right? But again, what we're talking about is not the outside of the sole, it's the inside of the sole. It's the inside where your foot is actually hitting that boot. And if I, again, take that insole out, you know, if I compare these two, right, even from the onset, the La Sportiva one should give me way more support than the Vask, just because of the curvature of that arch, especially if I have high arches. But again, this is a super pliable foam. And there isn't going to be, especially if you're collapsing that arch every single time you're stepping down, right? It's not going to give you the support you need. It's going to conform to the shoe, and the shoe, relatively on the inside, is going to be relatively flat. There is some arch support here, but again, this part right here is also super pliable. So if you need if you have high arches, and you're going to be wearing a shoe like this because it's comfortable, but you need to mitigate it to help support your high arches, then there are ways of doing that. And that's where we get into aftermarket insoles. Now these can be either branded products that we're going to show you in a minute, like Superfeet, or they could be prescribed orthotics, either one. If we're getting into using those types of aftermarket products, what are we looking for? This relates to volume too, which I'll touch on in a second. But if I have high arches, I want that same type of support that I would find in this normally, but in a much stiffer, less pliable piece of material, right? So I still have the pliability up here in the toes. That's because, again, I'm walking like this. The support here, where that arch support is needed, is not pliable at all. It's nice and stiff. It basically locks my arch into where it needs to be. So I'm not gonna compress this part of my arch right here. So I don't have that issue, right, of compressing those bones on my feet, all right? One other thing that Superfeet will do too, regardless if you have high arches or low arches, this will also fill up the boot. So now it's a good segue into the next topic, which is volume. Okay, when we talk about volume, what do we mean by volume? We talk about arch support, what do we mean by volume? Volume really pertains to any sort of modification of the existing boot in relationship to how your feet are going to fit into that boot and how much space your physical foot will take up in that particular shoe. Okay? One of the previous videos we talked about a boot being too tight or too loose, okay, and want it to be comfortable. Generally, if you have a boot that's too tight, that means that the volume that shoe can accept, or the capacity level that shoe can accept, is a little bit too small compared to the size of your foot. That's not just a length. We're not talking about like size 13 to size 10. That generally pertains to the length, although it does relate to volume. This is more of just the upper part of the boot and how much space that boot can take, okay? And if we are modifying that boot with an insole of any kind, whether it be a Superfeet or an orthotic, the more, like for example, the green, which is Superfeet's most common and most popular one, this not only has a high arch support, but it also has a high volume. A high volume means as soon as I put this into a boot, say this Vask Breeze LNT, as soon as I put that in here, that significantly reduces the amount of space inside the boot for my foot to fit in it. So if I am feeling relatively comfortable in, say, a size 10 in this boot, but I need that high arch support, I might want to go up to a size 10.5 or a size 11. But I want to try that with the insoles inside the boot. Now, luckily at Midwest Mountaineering here, we have a plethora of sizes of the different versions of Superfeet, so you actually physically can walk around with these in your shoes or your boots around the store to get a sense of how they're going to feel. Because again, what we don't want, even though we're modifying, if it's perfect, if it feels great right out the gate without the insole, and you're like, I need that extra support, or I need just a little bit more support because I have relatively low arches, but for some reason that insole that I get in there is just not giving me what I need. We want to basically have you put this in there and walk around with it, because no matter what, whether you go with a green or a carbon, right? Carbon is going to be the low arch, low volume version of Superfeet. I'm still going to be filling up that boot just a little bit. And so what I don't want to do is I don't want to now risk the boot being too tight once I throw one of these Superfeet in. Okay, so that's what we're talking about volume. We're talking about volume is, using math, as our way of describing it. Volume is the amount of space my foot takes up in that boot, whether I'm talking about the boot right out of the box or whether I'm talking about after modifications. There are a number of companies, as I mentioned also in one of the previous videos, that have done a really good job of modifying their insoles right out of the box. And I'm going to call out Oboz because they've done a fantastic job. They actually have a really fantastic insole that comes with all of their shoes, which is why Oboz is one of the most popular brands of shoes that we sell. One, they still have a pliable toe in here, much like you get with Superfeets, right? But the back end is not as pliable. It's much more supportive. It still a little bit is because, again, we're not talking about a plastic cap on the bottom of the Superfeet, right, to hold in that and lock in that arch support. But it's a significant better product than something that comes out of the box that does this, okay? So I get that arch support I want. I also have a lot of cushion, both under the balls of my feet as well as in the back of my heel. Now, so one of the things that actually Superfeet doesn't have is that I have the cushion I want where I'm doing most of my impact, but a lot of times some folks actually walk heel to toe. And so there is some impact that happens in the back end of the heel as well. So Oboz is actually putting some of the soft cushion foam on the back side of the insole. Actually helps improve the cushioning you get when you walk. Between the two, they're both fantastic, right? But for an insole to be made like this right out of the box for any of Oboz's shoes is a huge step in the right direction, so I had to call them out. So not every shoe that you buy is gonna have a really pliable insole. Some of them are gonna come with really great insoles right out of the box. And the other thing that I didn't mention is when we talk about certain drops, when we say 0 drop or half drop or a full drop, what does that mean? Most common when we're talking about drop is usually resulting with trail runners. All right, trail runners, generally most of them are gonna have either a 0 drop or a half drop, right? 0 drop being ultra is being one of the most common, is that there is, as you can tell on the shoe, there is no arch at all. On the inside, it's the exact same thing. If I pull this insole out, there is no arch at all in that insole, right? That's a 0 drop shoe. If I have high arches and I need that additional support, I might still go with the green. I may not go with this one because this is primarily used for hiking. Or if I want to, I can go with the Adapt. Adapt version is a newer version that Superfeet came out that actually, believe it or not, adapts to your foot. One thing I might do is if I really want a 0 drop, I love the cushion in this shoe, I want that flat material, but I need a little bit more support than I would get with just the arch that's in here. There's two ways of going about it. One is to, unfortunately, look at a different shoe that has more of an arch support in it. It is not a 0 drop shoe. Or, again, using Superfeet as an example, I can take an insole that's designed for trail runners. So I still get the cushioning and the feeling I want out of a 0 drop shoe, but I still have the arch support that I need, and I have that impact foam that I want on the actual insole. So as I'm running, right, I'm putting my foot down like this and I'm pushing forward, I have most of the impact foam on the front edge of that shoe. So choosing the best boot that specifically works really well with your particular foot, depending if you have high arches or low arches or somewhere in between. One of the best things you can do to, one, if you don't know that, is to come and visit one of us here at Minneapolis Mountaineering, or actually a different foot store, or even better, if you have the opportunity and you want to know more, is actually visit with a foot doctor. Believe it or not, there are foot doctors out there, and they're going to give you a lot more information on kind of how your foot is designed. I mean, we're experts in particularly relating to hiking boots, hiking shoes, trail runners, and how that foot is going to work with a particular brand or model of footwear. But I'll be honest, I'm not a foot doctor. I know general anatomy and how it works in relationship to feet and footwear and types of footwear, both in the knowledge I've done and just experience in wearing shoes. But if you're really concerned and you have particular issues, some types of parts of your feet, whether it be your balls of your feet, your heel, things like that, just in general, I highly recommend to go visit a foot doctor. because they're going to give you at least really good suggestions on what you're going to need regardless of what shoes you're getting, whether it be hiking boots or hiking shoes or even just general office shoes. How to choose the right socks for the footwear you're getting. There's a lot of things to think about when we're talking about socks. All right, even though it seems a relatively minor thing to be thinking about, we're talking about, okay, it's just fabric for my feet. Why is it so important? Well, it depends on the material, depends on a number of different things. So material-wise, most socks are made of wool, a poly or nylon blend, and then cotton, right? We also talk about cushion, right? There's a certain amount of materials or certain socks, whether they be running socks or hiking socks, going to have zero or light cushion. They're going to have full or extra cushion. What does that mean? Do I want a sock that is barely anything and barely comes up to my ankle, or do I want a sock that goes all the way up to my knee? Which one do I decide there, or anything in between? Do I want lightweight or heavy? Right? Do I want something that's breathable on my feet, or heavy and thick to keep my foot warm? So how do I choose with all these different things in mind? Right? Well, first of all, when we're talking about material, cotton used to be the way to go. All right, it used to be what everybody wore was cotton socks. And cotton socks are extremely comfortable. Don't get me wrong. They're not the best for outdoor activities. I mean, there's a whole phrase, cotton kills. Not necessarily, but they're just not the best socks to wear when you're out in outdoor activity. The best ones, ironically, are wool. Wool is antimicrobial. It also insulates when it becomes wet. So if you do get water inside your boot, or you build up moisture inside your boot or your shoe, your feet are going to stay relatively warm. And it's also a natural fiber. The natural fiber, though, has a vulnerability. Because it is a natural fiber, it's not as durable as a synthetic fiber. So when we're talking about wool socks, in case of Smart Wool, Darn Tough, Farm to Feet, any of those brands, when we're talking about wool socks, the reality is that those socks are not 100% wool. They're about maybe 60 to 75% wool. The rest of that material is to help with durability and elasticity. So generally, you don't have any cotton in them, but generally you're going to have a blend of nylon and poly in there to help improve the durability of the overall sock and the elasticity, especially around your ankle or where that cuff of the sock is. Now there are socks that are just nylon liners. Those are generally what I would call liner socks. So if I'm wearing, say, a pair of ice climbing boots, or I'm wearing a pair of ski boots, or mountaineering boots, something where I'm in an extreme cold weather climate and I want to throw a liner on. A liner is going to be that first sock I put around my foot, and then I'm going to put the rest of the socks, whether they be ski socks or real thick mountaineering or hiking socks, things that are going to give me the warmth I need and the cushion I need on top of that. Those are only used in specific situations, and so the reality is for any sort of outdoor hiking activity or activity where you're going to be walking on your feet day in and day out, the wool blend is probably the best sock to buy. And I'm not talking about brand specificity, I'm just talking about in general. Wool socks are probably the best socks to buy. Now, when we talk about lightweight versus heavy, what does that mean? Where would I want a lightweight sock over a heavy sock? Again, it's subjective. It depends on the trip you're doing, all right? Or it depends on the activity you're doing. If I'm just running around, let's say around the lakes in Minneapolis or Detroit or Los Angeles or wherever, and I'm just running on pavement, or even if I'm doing trail running, if I'm out in Colorado, I'm just running on the trails, I don't necessarily need a real thick sock. I want something that's going to be breathable, number one, which wool is also extremely breathable. But I also want something that's going to give me enough material around my foot to protect my foot, but not enough to overheat my foot or give me too much cushion. Generally, when you're running or when you're choosing any footwear, you're looking at stability on the shoe and the cushioning in the shoe to begin with before you even get to your socks. Sometimes, depending on the product, you might need extra cushion in the sock, but for running in particular, we're talking about a trail running shoe, there's a lot of cushion underfoot in trail running because of the amount of impact you're putting on the foot when you run. And so you generally would want to go with something, one, relatively lightweight, and also doesn't have a lot of cushion. Most running socks, whether they be from Smart Wool, Darn Tough, or any other brands that make a wool blend sock, most running socks are going to be zero cushion, right? They're also going to be extremely lightweight, again, because I'm generating a significant amount of body heat. And I'm also in a relatively warm area. Now, go to the other extreme, where I'm going to be in an area where it's relatively cold out, I'm going to want something a little bit heavier, right? I want a hiker, I want a mountaineering sock. Those are also generally going to have a lot more cushion underfoot. Now the reason they have more cushion underfoot is because of when I'm using them primarily. There's a reason this one in particular is called a hiking sock. I am generally going to be wearing this sock the majority of times I'm wearing either a high or a mid-ankle backpacking boot, right? I am constantly putting my feet on the ground on relatively rough terrain. I'm on a trail out in Colorado. I'm on a talus field somewhere in, the Canadian Rockies or in the Alps or somewhere where I'm in an area that's extremely harsh on my feet, but I have the protection in my boot, but I have added protection not only in warmth, but also in cushion underneath the foot, okay? So hiking, relatively warm socks, that's where I'm gonna go with relatively heavier duty socks, all right? Now there's actually socks that are in between. When we're talking about full cushion and light cushion. This is kind of where it gets confusing, all right? These are not considered lightweight or heavyweight. These are kind of right in the middle. And this, again, depends on this really depends on where you're gonna be. Am I gonna be in, like if I'm hiking the Spear Hiking Trail, right, and I'm hiking in, say, early spring, and I have a hiking shoe, I'm not carrying a lot of weight, so I'm not wearing a big backpacking boot. What sock might want to get? Well, the shoe that I have is very low cut, it's below my ankle. Based on my description so far, I might go with the sock that has light cushion and it's got a relatively low ankle. The reality is that because of the time I'm going, early spring, late fall, when it's a bit colder out, I actually might want to go with something with a little bit more weight to it. So I'm getting the extra warmth from this, I'm getting the extra cushion, and in this case, it actually is going to go above, way above the top of that shoe, which is still good, all right? Now, let's say I'm going in August, right? It's not the height of summer, it's not in July, but it's still relatively warm out. There, I might be okay with a light cushion sock rather than a full cushion sock. So again, these are things to be thinking about when I'm choosing the sock I'm going to need in relationship to heavy or lightweight. We talked about cushion. Cushion is much like Superfeet, much like other aftermarket things. Cushion is one other thing you can throw into the toolbox when you're talking about creating a solid, comfortable fit for your foot that allows you to get more comfortability out of not only the boot itself, but the other things you're wearing, in this case, your socks. It's going to give you more of that comfortable, nice kind of wool blanket feeling underneath your foot as you're walking. It gives you more cushion, hence the name, underneath that foot as you impact the ground. Okay, so if you need that, if you need more arch support, if you have plantar fasciitis, is a great example, I might want to get a sock, even if it's a heavier sock, that has more cushion underneath the actual foot itself versus something that has no cushion. Right? The last thing to consider then also is, okay, do I want something that is high ankle or low ankle, right? Up to the base of my knee, or do I want something that's right above my ankle? That strictly depends on the type of footwear I'm wearing. If I'm wearing a hiking shoe that's relatively low below my ankle, I don't have to have one that goes up to my knee. In fact, unless you're trying to make a statement, you don't necessarily need to have socks that high. But in the case of ski boots or mountaineering boots or something where the boot is significantly high, even winter boots, a lot of times will have real high cuffs. There's a lot of boots that have real tall, high cuffs. Or if I'm wearing muck boots in the Boundary Waters or bogs or any of those real high work boots, I want a sock that goes up to my knee. Because where that cuff of that boot is, if it's on fresh skin, that's generally where you get a lot of those rashes and issues. One question that I actually get asked quite a bit, how do I maintain or increase the longevity or the lifespan of any footwear? Whether I'm buying 4-grain boot, leather boot, or any sort of footwear. It doesn't have to be hiking and backpacking, but it can be any footwear. And especially when I mentioned earlier about footwear wanting to be comfortable, wanting to conform to your foot, you find boots that fit really, really well. Especially if it's a boot that you've loved and cherished forever and they've redesigned the boot into something else. So the question I get is how do I make my favorite boot last as long as possible, number one. And two, when do I know that it's finally time for me to retire these boots and get a new pair? First thing is, cleaning your shoes as much as possible. Whenever you're out hiking, backpacking, running, if you get dirt, mud, sand, grime, water, anything, you want to clean your footwear as much as you can. All those different organic materials that get embedded into certain parts of your shoe eventually will break down the shoe enough where the sole start to detach, or the material actually start to break down, whether it be leather, faux leather, fabric, doesn't matter. All that organic material eventually will start to break down your shoe. A lot of times too, like not cleaning them will also make your shoes become discolored. So I actually end up with a shoe that might look really great when you first buy them. You know, a year or two down the road, you've used them enough, because you're supposed to use these shoes, right? Not just supposed to sit in the pedestal. Eventually, when you get to a point where you haven't cleaned them, they'll start to discolor. They become super grimy and dirty, and again, that gives it some characteristics and flavor, but it also is doing a lot to deteriorate the actual shoe. So cleaning your shoe as much as possible is one of the first things you need to make sure of. And how do you do that? Well, a couple of ways. Obviously, just spraying it off with water and letting it dry, perfect. Right? Especially if it's loose material like sand, mud, dirt, that kind of stuff. Sand, unfortunately, is a bit trickier just because a lot of times it'll get embedded in the actual sole itself. I had a pair of shoes at one point where the sand actually got underneath the front sole, and I could feel the sand in there and hear it sloshing around. So sand is unfortunately one of the nemesis of any sort of footwear. But if you're using water, if you're cleaning off as much as possible, even when you're out hiking, if you're hitting to a sandy part and you're getting ready to kind of take your shoes off for the day, or you're getting ready to get back in your vehicle to go home, wash them off right then and there real quick. Get all that stuff off. Even just dipping it right into a lake or a river and cleaning them off will make your life way easier when you get home to actually physically clean them. So once you've done the water thing, you've got most of the visible stuff off. How do you do the rest of it? Especially with sand and smaller stuff getting into the actual fabric. And that's where you get into materials like cleaning gel or sandal wash, where you can actually use this, and this material actually will scrub itself into the actual shoe material itself. It'll get in there, it'll be basically like soap for your shoes. It'll get in there, it'll clean it all out, spray it off again with water, and let it dry. Doing that almost every single time you go out on a relatively big trip. Now, if you're in an area where you don't have a lot of organic material around, you just running on pavement, and it's nice out, it's not raining, and so you're not going to be in many spaces where you need a lot of that organic material on your shoes. You don't necessarily have to wash them off, but 85% of the time you're going to have something that's going to end up on your shoe somewhere, and you want to use the gel or something like it to clean it off. Once you do that, once you've cleaned off your shoe, you spray it off with water, you've cleaned all the grime and the organic material off of it, how do you effectively dry your shoes? The best way is to wash it all off and then take the insole out and then lean it on its side and let it air out that way. It does two things. One, it lets the actual liquid water, and I mentioned this in the waterproof video, it lets the liquid water drain out, but it also allows the natural airflow of the shoe to release out of both the actual part where your ankle is, as well as this part below the laces. That's the most vulnerable, less material spots of the entire shoe, and that's where that air is going to want to go. So doing it like this, heat rises, but air doesn't rise. You want to have it this way so it actually kind of flows out. Okay, so leaning them outside, make sure you pull this out, is one really great way to actually dry out your boots. You can, although it's not advised, you can actually use boot dryers, where they be like something like this, where you're actually putting it in there and it creates a fan and dries it out that way. Or there's ones that are vertical that actually blow air in, you kind of put your boots on top of them. Those are great if you need the boots right away the next day. Or if you've got, say, like a pair of ice cream or mountaineering boots, or a boot that has like an inner boot inside of it. The only thing you're actually drying out is the inner boot, not the outside, right? So I personally tend to not use these when I'm drying out a pair of hiking shoes. Especially if I don't need them the next day, I will just pull the insole out, lay it on its side, let them dry on their own. The reason being is that if you use those boot dryers, fast boot dryers on hiking boots, especially if they're waterproof, like these, believe it or not, that actually ends up deteriorating the fabric inside the shoe faster than if you were just letting them dry out on their own. So I tend not to use boot dryers unless I absolutely need the boots the next day. Now, if I'm out on the trail, I don't bring these with me when I'm out on the trail, okay? I generally just leave them on the side. And that's when we talk about waterproof versus non-waterproof. If I'm cleaning them off, I need them to dry out fast, I'm going with the non-waterproof one. I'll leave them on the side, pull the insole out, put them in the sun, they're dry within about maybe an hour or two. Second thing to think about is, I've washed my shoes numerous times, but I've gotten that sand and that grime and grit into the bottom of my sole, and now my outsole is starting to become detached from the physical shoe. Does it mean that I have to now get a new pair of boots? Not necessarily. If you catch it early enough and you're able to kind of peel a little bit more of that back, clean out some of the grime and stuff that's causing the sole to become detached, you can actually use a product called Resole and actually re-adhere that sole to the actual boot. Because the reason it's becoming detached, and this goes back to cleaning, is that sand and grime and everything is removing or deteriorating the adhesive that adheres that outsole to my boot. Once that comes undone, it's eventually going to keep going. So if I get to a point where I've got maybe half the insole coming off, all I got to do is really clean that thing out, really get it clean, let it dry, and then throw the resole on and resole that back on there. It's basically re-adhering the sole to your boot. You put it on there, you clamp it together, you let it sit for almost 24 hours to 48 hours, and you're golden. Your sole is now back on it. And you can even test it too to make sure that if you were to step in water, you're not going to get water in the inside of that sole that'll come up through the bottom of the inside of the boot. One of the things we also talked about in one of the videos is waterproofing. I mentioned about the ability to waterproof a non-waterproof shoe. Now I'm not going to go into that topic again. What I am going to go into is, okay, if I have a boot, whether it be Gore-Tex, Be-Dry, any other proprietary waterproofing material, if I'm noticing, much like I would if I was wearing a Gore-Tex jacket, where I have certain parts of the jacket that are pooling, where moisture is collecting and it's not beating off the jacket anymore, which means I'm getting moisture not only embedded in the jacket but on the inside of the jacket, which makes the jacket no longer waterproof. The same can occur with footwear, where I'm getting pooling in certain parts of the boot, and that boot itself fully is no longer waterproof. So how do I re-waterproof that? Unlike a jacket, I can't throw my boots, well I could, but I can't throw my boots in the dryer, right? I can't wash them in the washing machine, I can't dry them, they'll just get destroyed, right? So how do I re-waterproof this? Because the heat from the dryer and jackets will reinvigorate that waterproofing membrane as well as the durable water repellency coating, or DWR, that's on top of the jacket. But I can't do that with footwear. So how do I re-waterproof this? That's where, depending on the footwear you're using, there's a number of different products that can help you re-waterproof it. And it's basically taking a waterproofing liquid and embellishing it around the outside of the boot. And that kind of depends on what types of boot you have. For example, if you're using nubuck and suede, like we're talking about maybe a nicer pair of boots or a winter pair of boots, a lot of winter boots have nubuck or suede leather on the outside. What this does is this is a spray-on, right? You spray it on your boot like that, right? Well, you can't see that. Just like this, all right? And then you'll use an emery cloth. And people are like, what is an emery cloth? Think of a Scotch-Brite. That green rough pad on the edge of a Scotch-Brite, that's emery cloth. And you're going to use that to basically scuff up the nubuck, and then spray this on and scuff it up again. And that allows the waterproofing to embed itself in the leather. The same is true with regular leather and fabric. So this is particularly for nubuck and suede, right? This one is for fabric and leather. So in this Loa Camino, which has a leather outsole, right? This upper is leather, and it's got Gore-Tex in it. I have certain pooling in this. I want to prevent that. How do I do that? I can take this waterproofing and embellish that into that particular area. I don't have to do the entire shoe, right? If it's only one spot that's causing it, I can focus all my attention with this is a little bit different applicator, but I can put all my attention from this into that one spot. And this sponge on here is going to help embellish the material, the liquid into the actual leather, as well as quote unquote scuff up that leather. It's not actually going to scuff it up, but it's going to help the liquid embellish itself into that fabric, okay? Or leather if we're doing leather boots. Now what if we're talking about full grain leather? All right, this is kind of mid-grain leather. It's not a full grain leather because it has other materials in the actual shoe. So what if we're talking about a full grain leather boot, right? Pair of Red Wings, you know, there's a number of other brands that make full grain like leather work boots. How do we re-waterproof those? There's two different ways. One is you can use something similar to this that's just for leather. It's just leather waterproofing. It's not a leather and fabric, it's just leather. Or you can use a wax cream. I prefer the wax cream. The reason being is that it's just like a tube of toothpaste. I'm gonna put some on a fabric and I'm gonna basically put that around the entirety outside of the boot. So in this case of full grain leather, I am gonna waterproof the entire thing. I'm not just gonna focus on one area because most leather boots that are full grain leather won't have a Gore-Tex membrane on them. Some do, but most won't. And so they have some other waterproofing on them. This is basically gonna seal up that leather, all right? It's gonna re-waterproof it. You can dip it in water, make sure it works, and off you go. All you're gonna do is basically squeeze this out, rub it in, let it dry, maybe do one more coat, rub it in, let it dry, you're good to go. One of the downsides to using that cream is that they become waterproof, which means you're constantly stepping in water. And in the wintertime, we basically are also stepping in water a lot with snow and things like that, when the snow melts or when we get snow. But the other one main issue with walking in the winter is salt from the roads. Salt will ruin leather boots to no end unless you maintain and take care of them. So conditioning your leather boots periodically throughout the year, not just in the winter, but periodically throughout the year, because even arid, dry areas will tend to, because leather is a organic material, right? It's for lack of a phrase, it's animal skin, okay? Much like everything else, just like, you know, my skin, I have to put lotion on it to keep it from drying out. The same goes true for your leather boots. So you have to use a conditioner that's gonna basically, it does two things. One, it basically kind of reinvigorates the life of that leather, number one, and it prevents the cracking from forming on the outside of your boot. So, and I can use it on either full grain leather boots or ones that have kind of a combination. This still works great because what it does is it prevents this from cracking, and if I don't do that and allow it to crack, that's where you're gonna allow that waterproofing that's no longer there. That water is gonna seep right in through those cracks, and it's actually gonna cause the cracks to spread. So, and this goes back to the first thing, which is cleaning, right? We're talking about walking around in the wintertime with salt, things like that. I gotta clean my footwear, and I wanna condition it throughout the year just to make sure that I'm reinvigorating that leather. So that's a number of different things to kind of help maintain the overall part of the boot. Well, what happens if certain things break off, right? My laces break. We mentioned about the sole deteriorating and falling off the bottom. There's a number of different ways, obviously, you can do it yourself. I'm a DIYer. I love doing these things myself because I can learn. So the next time it happens, I just know exactly what to do. It's great, and it's way more cost effective. So using Resole to resole your shoes, just buying a new set of laces, finding a way, you know, with a lot of these hiking boots, they have these metal brackets that allow you to kind of pull the lace in. What happens if a bracket falls off? I can maybe find a way to reattach it myself, or I can just go without, or many people don't realize this, cobblers still exist. Cobbler, if you're not familiar with the term cobbler is what they used to call basically a foot repairman, or a footwear repairman, or repair woman. They basically would fix or build footwear way back in the day, and the cobblers still are around. There's a number of cobblers here in Minneapolis. They'll actually fix your shoe. They'll re-adhere the sole. They'll take care of your EVA foam. EVA foam on the inside of the shoe, between the outer sole and the upper, is the first thing to deteriorate as far as material. They'll redo that. A bracket falls off your shoe, they'll find a replacement bracket, reattach it, you're good to go. You get another 5-6 more years out of that boot. So whether you're doing it yourself or trusting your cobbler, there are a number of different ways to make that boot last significantly longer. I hope you enjoyed the video series here on the most commonly asked questions we get at Mountaineering in our footwear department. Here at Minnesota Mountaineering, we're not about just selling you boots and shoes. We're about selling you an experience, both here at the store and the trail. So if you have any further questions about shoes, about socks, about maintaining your footwear, definitely leave some comments in below. If you have any questions further and you want to swing into the store, definitely come in, find myself, one of our footwear specialists will answer those questions for you. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the videos you're going to see here on the Minnesota Mountaineering YouTube channel, and we'll see you here in the store and the trail.